So there I was, minding my own business in the observation deck of Arena Complex Zeta 7, watching what was supposed to be a routine primitive species assessment for the Galactic Council's entertainment division. You know, the usual Tuesday afternoon blood sport where they throw some poor sap from a backwater planet into a pit with progressively nastier creatures until something interesting happens. What they didn't expect was for the poor sap to be a 5'0" human female who apparently decided that interesting meant turning the arena into her personal slaughterhouse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations managed to collectively step on the biggest rake in the known universe. The setup, or how to spectacularly misjudge a species. The Zephyrians had been bragging about their latest acquisition for weeks. "Oh, you simply must see our new specimen," High Curator Vexoth had been saying at every social gathering, his crystalline features practically glowing with smugness. "A perfect example of primitive Deathworld adaptation. Barely beyond stone tools." This, as it turned out, was their first mistake. See, when you're a species that evolved on a planet where the most dangerous thing is a mildly irritated flower that might give you a rash, your definition of dangerous tends to be a bit skewed. The Zephyrians had stumbled across what they thought was a primitive human settlement on some backwater moon in the Sol System's outer reaches. Military outpost, actually, but the translation software had some trouble with the concept of Special Forces Training Facility. Easy mistake. Could happen to anyone. Really. The specimen shows remarkable physical conditioning for such a primitive biped, Curator Vexoth had noted in his official report, which I'd managed to get my tentacles on through completely legitimate channels that definitely didn't involve bribing his assistant with rare crystalline formations. The specimen in question was currently sitting in a holding cell 3 levels below us, probably wondering why her morning jog had been interrupted by a tractor beam and several very confused aliens speaking broken English. Lieutenant Cassidy Brooks, according to the file I definitely wasn't supposed to have. Age 26. Specialization: close quarters. Combat and advanced problem solving. The Zephyrians had translated this as primitive tool use. I'd spent enough time around humans to know that when they put quotation marks around advanced problem solving, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. The contestants, or a parade of poor life choices. The arena itself was a thing of beauty, I'll give the Zephyrians that. 200 meters across, variable terrain that could shift from jungle to desert to urban environment at the touch of a button, and surrounded by energy barriers that could theoretically contain a small nuclear explosion. Theoretically. The first wave of opponents had been carefully selected to provide escalating entertainment value while maintaining specimen safety. This is corporate speak for, let's see how long the primitive can run around before something eats her. Wave 1 consisted of 3 Krillian hunting beasts. Think oversized praying mantises with delusions of grandeur and an attitude problem. Each one was roughly the size of a small vehicle, equipped with razor-sharp claws that could slice through most known metals, and possessed of what the Krillians like to call efficient predatory instincts. The Zephyrians had thoughtfully provided the human with a primitive melee weapon appropriate to her developmental level. A steel combat knife that looked like a toothpick compared to the beasts she was facing. "Beginning assessment protocol," announced the arena's AI in that annoyingly cheerful tone that all advanced civilizations seem to program into their death machines. "Specimen will now demonstrate survival capabilities against basic threat-level entities." In the observation deck, several hundred beings from across the galaxy settled in with their snacks and beverages, expecting a show that would last maybe 10-15 minutes tops. The betting pools were already taking wagers on which beast would make the kill. The smart money was on all 3 simultaneously, within the first minute. As it turned out, the smart money was apparently pretty stupid. Hour 1, the introduction, or when primitive becomes oh shit. The arena barrier lowered with a dramatic hum that was definitely designed by someone who'd watched too many Gladiator holovids. Cassidy Brooks stepped out into the sandy floor of the arena, took one look at the 3 chittering death machines being released from the opposite gate, and did something completely unexpected. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a scared smile. The kind of smile that predators give when they spot something they want to play with for a while before eating it. "Huh," I muttered to myself, adjusting my position for a better view. In my 15 years as a freelance xenobiologist, I'd learned to recognize certain expressions across species lines. That particular smile was universal. It meant someone was about to get educated. The first Krillian beast charged immediately, because apparently millions of years of evolution had failed to teach it about patience, or tactics, or basic threat assessment. Cassidy didn't run. She didn't dodge dramatically. She simply stepped slightly to her left at the last possible second, let the beast's momentum carry it past her, and drove her little knife directly into what I recognized as the Krillian nervous system cluster located just behind the head. The beast went down like a sack of rocks. Total elapsed time, 4 seconds. The observation deck went dead silent. Even the concession vendors stopped hawking their overpriced snacks. Did that just happen? Whispered Ambassador Keltar from the Regelian delegation, his eye stalks trembling with what I was pretty sure was existential dread. The second beast, showing marginally more intelligence than its deceased colleague, tried a more cautious approach. It circled around, looking for an opening, occasionally feinting forward to test the human's reactions. Cassidy watched it with the kind of patient interest usually reserved for studying particularly fascinating insects, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. When the beast finally committed to its attack, she was already moving. Not away from it, toward it. She ducked under its primary striking limbs, rolled across its back, and somehow managed to sever 3 of its legs in a single fluid motion that looked less like combat and more like very violent ballet. The beast toppled, and she finished it with a quick thrust to the same nervous cluster she'd targeted on the first one. Total elapsed time since entering the arena, 37 seconds. Body count 2. This is highly irregular, Curator Vexoth was muttering into his communication device. The combat algorithms indicate this should not be possible. Primitive bipeds don't possess the reflexes necessary for... He was interrupted by the sound of the third beast dying. Cassidy had apparently gotten bored with the waiting game. She'd simply walked up to the last Krillian while it was still trying to process what had happened to its packmates, grabbed it by what passed for its head, and twisted until something important went snap. She then looked up at the observation deck, shrugged, and called out in perfectly clear galactic standard. So, what's next? The silence stretched for approximately forever and a half. The escalation, or doubling down on stupid. You'd think at this point someone with half a brain would have said, you know what? Maybe we should reassess this situation. Perhaps conduct some interviews. Maybe ask the human where exactly she learned to dismantle apex predators with the casual efficiency of someone changing a light bulb. But you'd be underestimating the galaxy's capacity for bureaucratic stupidity. Clearly the initial assessment parameters were insufficient, Curator Vexoth announced after a hurried conference with his fellow academics. We must escalate to determine the specimen's true capabilities. Wave 2 was released before anyone could suggest, maybe, just maybe, asking the human if she wanted a snack and a chance to explain where she'd come from. This wave consisted of 5 draconian war constructs. Mechanical killing machines about the size of small buildings, equipped with energy weapons, armor plating, and the kind of advanced targeting systems that could track a specific molecule across a solar system. They were designed by a species that had spent the last 1,000 years perfecting the art of warfare, and had field-tested these particular models against 3 different civilizations, all of which were now extinct. Cassidy took one look at them and actually laughed. "Oh, come on," she called up to the observation deck. "Is this supposed to be a challenge or a warm-up exercise?" The first construct opened fire with plasma cannons that could melt through a battleship's hull. Cassidy was already moving, using the arena's terrain features for cover, closing distance with a tactical precision that would have made her instructors proud. She reached the first construct in under 10 seconds, somehow managed to climb onto its back while it was trying to track her, and began doing something to its sensor array with her knife. "What is she doing?" asked someone in the observation deck. "I believe," said Dr. Wixall, a cybernetics expert from the Andromedan Collective. "She's performing field surgery on its primary processing unit." The construct began spinning wildly, trying to dislodge its unwanted passenger. Cassidy held on with one hand while continuing her impromptu mechanical engineering project with the other. The construct's weapon systems began firing randomly, at the walls, at the other constructs, at what I was pretty sure was the arena's snack bar. Then it started making a noise that sounded disturbingly like screaming, if machines could scream. Then it exploded. Cassidy had somehow jumped clear at exactly the right moment, landed in a roll, and was already sprinting toward the second construct before the debris stopped falling. "She weaponized it," Dr. Wixall whispered in what might have been awe or terror. "She turned a military-grade war machine into an improvised explosive device using nothing but a primitive blade, and apparently an advanced understanding of cybernetic weak points that our own engineers took decades to identify." The second construct lasted 18 seconds. The third managed 21, but only because Cassidy seemed to be experimenting with different approaches to mechanical dismemberment. By the time she'd finished with the fifth construct, which she'd somehow managed to turn into a mobile artillery platform that she rode around the arena like a very violent parade float, the observation deck had gone through several distinct phases of reaction. Phase 1, shocked silence. Phase 2, nervous muttering. Phase 3, the kind of quiet that happens when an entire crowd of sentient beings simultaneously realizes they may have made a horrible mistake. We were currently deep into Phase 3. Total elapsed time, announced the arena's AI with what I swear was a note of bewilderment in its synthesized voice. 43 minutes. Casualty count, 8 entities neutralized. Human specimen appears to be uninjured and alert. Cassidy was standing in the middle of the arena, surrounded by the smoking remains of 2 waves of what were supposed to be progressively more dangerous opponents, looking like she'd just finished a particularly enjoyable morning workout. She looked up at the observation deck again and called out, "Hey! You guys got anything that might actually make me break a sweat?" Hour 2. The panic. Or, when smart people do dumb things. The observation deck erupted into what can only be described as controlled chaos. Which is to say, completely uncontrolled chaos with better lighting. Curator Vexoth was frantically consulting with his team of xenobiologists, all of whom were flipping through their notes with the desperate energy of students who just realized they'd been studying for the wrong exam. The initial species assessment must have been flawed, Dr. Yithmore was saying, his tentacles writhing with academic anxiety. No primitive biped should possess these capabilities. Unless, suggested Dr. Klexon from the Observation Sciences Division, they're not actually primitive. The silence that followed this observation was the kind that could power a small planet. Impossible, Curator Vexoth declared with the confidence of someone who was definitely about to be proven wrong. The initial reconnaissance clearly showed basic tool usage, primitive shelter construction, no evidence of advanced technology. Sir, interrupted junior researcher Plimox, who'd been frantically working at a data terminal. I'm reading some irregularities in the initial survey data. What kind of irregularities? Well, sir, it appears the primitive shelters were constructed from materials that register as unknown composite armor plating. And the basic tools seem to emit some kind of quantum signature that our sensors can't identify. In the arena below, Cassidy had apparently gotten bored with waiting and was now doing what looked like stretching exercises. Occasionally, she'd call up suggestions like, maybe something with more teeth, or, do you guys have anything that flies? Furthermore, Plimox continued, his voice getting higher with each revelation, the location where we found the specimen appears to be not actually a primitive settlement. Then what is it? According to the most recent analysis of the collected data, it appears to be some sort of military training facility. Advanced military training facility, the kind where they teach individuals to what, researcher? To eliminate multiple hostiles in close quarters combat scenarios using improvised weapons and environmental advantages. The observation deck fell silent again, except for the sound of several dozen highly advanced beings having the same realization simultaneously. They had kidnapped a professional soldier, from a species they knew absolutely nothing about, from a planet that was apparently classified as a Deathworld for reasons that were rapidly becoming clear. And then they had put her in an arena and expected her to die for their entertainment. Oh, said Curator Vexoth in a very small voice. Oh dear. The consultation, or asking the right questions too late. Perhaps, suggested Ambassador Keltar with the careful tone of someone navigating a minefield, we should establish communication with the specimen before proceeding further. This was such a radically sensible idea that it took the assembled academics several minutes to process it. The arena's communication system crackled to life. Curator Vexoth cleared his throat nervously and leaned toward the microphone. Greetings, specimen. That is, greetings, sentient entity. I am High Curator Vexoth of the Zephyrian Collective. Might I inquire as to your origin and current intentions? Cassidy looked up at the observation deck with an expression that was somehow both amused and deeply terrifying. Well, hey there, she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustics. Lieutenant Cassidy Brooks, 3rd Battalion, Special Operations Division, Human Expeditionary Force. I was on a training exercise when your people decided to interrupt my morning with a tractor beam and some very confused aliens who kept pointing at me and making excited chittering noises. She paused to examine her knife, which had somehow remained perfectly clean despite the carnage of the last hour. As for my current intentions, she continued, well, I figure I'm either in some kind of first contact scenario gone sideways, or I've been kidnapped by aliens who think I'm some sort of exotic pet. Either way, I'm planning to keep killing things until someone explains what's going on and offers to give me a ride home. The observation deck processed this information with all the grace and efficiency of a computer trying to divide by zero. 3rd Battalion? Whispered Dr. Wixall. Special Operations Division? What kind of species organizes their civilians into numbered combat units? The dangerous kind, I muttered, though I don't think anyone heard me. Curator Vexoth tried again. Perhaps you could clarify the nature of your training exercise? Sure, Cassidy replied cheerfully. Advanced multi-threat neutralization in hostile environments. We call it Tuesday. The idea is to see how many different kinds of problems you can solve with minimal equipment and maximum creativity. She gestured at the smoking ruins around her. So far, you guys are providing excellent training scenarios. Very realistic threat escalation, good variety in opponent capabilities. My instructors would be impressed. She paused thoughtfully. Though I have to say, your combat AI could use some work. These things are way too predictable. No tactical adaptation, no group coordination. It's like fighting training dummies. In the observation deck, the Draconian military attaché made a strangled noise that his translator rendered as either impossible or, oh God, we're all going to die. With Draconian, it was often hard to tell the difference. The attaché managed, did she just critique our most advanced military hardware? I believe, said Dr. Wixall faintly. She just called our apex predator constructs training dummies. The conference, or emergency session of What Have We Done? An emergency recess was called. The observation deck cleared except for the senior staff and a few military observers who looked like they were having religious experiences. And not the good kind. I managed to stick around by virtue of having excellent hearing and an even better ability to look like I belonged wherever I happened to be standing. Options, Curator Vexoth said without preamble. I need options. We could explain the situation, suggested Dr. Klexon. Apologize for the misunderstanding, offer to return her to her point of origin. And admit to the Galactic Council that we accidentally kidnapped a soldier from an unknown species and then tried to feed her to arena beasts for entertainment? Vexoth's crystalline features had taken on a distinctly greenish tinge. The diplomatic incident alone would end my career. The lawsuits would bankrupt the collective. We could claim it was intentional, offered junior researcher Plimox. A deliberate first contact protocol, cultural exchange through competitive combat scenarios. Everyone stared at him. Just a thought, he added weakly. The problem, said the Draconian attaché, is that we've established a pattern of escalation. If we stop now, we look incompetent. If we continue? He trailed off, looking down at the arena where Cassidy was now apparently practicing some kind of hand-to-hand combat routine that involved moves I was pretty sure weren't anatomically possible for most species. If we continue, Dr. Wixall finished, we might accidentally start a war with a species that considers this level of combat training a Tuesday morning warm-up. Curator Vexoth was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. I could practically see the calculations running through his head. Career suicide versus potential species extinction. What's our most advanced arena scenario? He finally asked. Sir, Plimox said carefully, surely you're not considering... Wave 3, Vexoth continued as if he hadn't heard. Full combat protocol. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. If the specimen truly possesses the capabilities she's demonstrated, then we need to establish the full extent of her abilities for the official record. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of intelligent beings watches someone make a decision that they know, with absolute certainty, is going to end badly for everyone involved. Sir, Dr. Wixall said very carefully, Wave 3 protocol includes the Guardian entities. I'm aware. The ones that were designed specifically to be undefeatable. The ones we created to demonstrate the ultimate futility of violent resistance to galactic authority. I said I'm aware. The ones that have never been deployed in actual combat because the simulation data suggested they might be too effective and could potentially cause psychological trauma to observer species. Curator Vexoth looked down at the arena, where Cassidy had apparently grown tired of her exercise routine and was now examining the remains of the war constructs with what looked like professional interest. Deploy Wave 3, he said. Wave 3, the Guardian Protocol, or Escalation to, Oh God, why? If Waves 1 and 2 had been designed to test a specimen's survival capabilities, Wave 3 was designed to demonstrate the absolute supremacy of galactic civilization over primitive aggression. The Guardian entities were the collective's masterpiece of military engineering, 3 biomechanical constructs that incorporated the best defensive and offensive capabilities of a dozen different species, enhanced with artificial intelligence systems that could adapt to any combat scenario in real time, and powered by contained antimatter cores that could theoretically level a small city. They had been designed by committee, built by the finest military contractors in the galaxy, and tested in simulation against every known combat scenario. The results had been uniformly spectacular, and uniformly one-sided. The Guardian entities had never lost. Not once. Not ever. Which is probably why nobody thought to test them against a species that nobody knew anything about. "Initiating Wave 3 protocol," announced the Arena AI, and for the first time I could swear I heard a note of uncertainty in its voice. "Warning. The following entities represent maximum threat level scenarios. Observer discretion is advised." The arena floor began to shift and change, transforming from a simple circular battlefield into something that looked like a cross between an urban warfare training ground and a nightmare. Buildings rose from the floor, complete with multiple levels, hidden passages, and what I recognized as tactical choke points designed to force specific engagement patterns. 3 portals opened simultaneously around the arena's perimeter. What came out of them was impressive and terrifying, mostly terrifying. The first Guardian was built like a tank crossed with a spider. 8 mechanical legs supporting a heavily armored torso bristling with weapon systems that I couldn't even identify. It moved with a fluid grace that suggested advanced kinesthetic processors and crossed the arena's new terrain like it had been designed specifically for this environment. Which it had. The second Guardian was more humanoid, but only in the way that a fever dream might be humanoid. 3 meters tall, armed with energy weapons that were apparently built into its arms, and covered in what looked like adaptive armor that shifted color and texture as it moved. The third Guardian was the one that made my scales stand on end. It looked almost organic, like someone had taken a predator from humanity's worst nightmares and then given it access to advanced technology. It didn't walk so much as flow across the terrain, and something about the way it moved suggested intelligence that was definitely not artificial. All 3 Guardians immediately began coordinating their movements with the kind of tactical precision that comes from shared processing power and unlimited communication bandwidth. In the observation deck, the tension was so thick you could have served it at a dinner party. Cassidy looked at the 3 approaching entities, looked up at the observation deck, and shrugged. "Now we're talking," she said. "The dance, or when professional meets professional." What happened next was, well, calling it a fight would be like calling a symphony noise. It was combat as performance art, violence as technical demonstration, and quite possibly the most educational hour of xenobiology I'd ever witnessed. The Spider Tank Guardian opened with a coordinated barrage that should have turned anything in a 50-meter radius into component atoms. Cassidy was already moving, using the arena's new architecture to break line of sight and force the Guardians to reposition. But these weren't the predictable opponents she'd faced in the first 2 waves. The Guardians adapted in real time, their targeting systems learning from each near miss, their movement patterns evolving to counter her tactics. For the first time since entering the arena, Cassidy had to actually try. It was beautiful. She flowed through the urban environment like water, using every piece of cover, every elevation advantage, every structural weakness in the hastily constructed buildings. When the humanoid Guardian tried to corner her in what should have been a tactical dead end, she somehow managed to turn the trap into an ambush, using the confined space to limit its weapon system's effectiveness while maximizing her own mobility advantage. The organic Guardian was learning too, though. It began predicting her movement patterns, forcing her to abandon tactics that had worked moments before. The Spider Tank provided covering fire that kept her from maintaining any single position for more than a few seconds. For 20 minutes it was a stalemate. The Guardians couldn't pin her down long enough to use their superior firepower, but she couldn't get close enough to use her knife effectively against their armor and defensive systems. Then Cassidy did something that made every military observer in the deck lean forward simultaneously. She stopped running. The innovation, or why humans are terrifying. Cassidy had taken cover behind what looked like a reinforced pillar in the center of the arena's urban maze. The 3 Guardians had positioned themselves at optimal firing angles, effectively trapping her in a kill zone with no apparent escape routes. It should have been over. Instead, Cassidy began talking. "Hey!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the arena. "You guys are pretty good. Definitely better than the last batch. Whoever programmed your tactical systems knows their stuff." The Guardians held their positions, waiting for her to make a move that would expose her to their crossfire. "I'm curious, though," she continued, and I could swear I heard amusement in her voice. "How good are your pattern recognition algorithms? Because I've been watching you adapt to my movements for the last 20 minutes. and I think I've figured out your primary tactical framework. In the observation deck, Dr. Wixall was frantically taking notes. She's analyzing them, he whispered. In the middle of combat, she's conducting real-time tactical analysis of our most advanced military systems. The thing about adaptive AI, Cassidy continued, still hidden behind her cover, is that it's really good at learning from patterns, but it's not so good at handling completely novel scenarios. She paused, and in that pause, something changed. I couldn't put my finger on what, but the atmosphere in the arena shifted somehow. For instance, she said, what happens when the target stops trying to escape and starts using the environment as a weapon? That's when I noticed what she'd been doing during those 20 minutes of apparent stalemate. Every position she'd taken, every piece of cover she'd used, every movement through the arena's manufactured urban environment. She hadn't been running from the Guardians. She'd been placing them, the structural supports she'd damaged during her evasive movements, the weapon scoring that had weakened key joints in the arena's construction, the way she'd forced the Guardians to position themselves at specific points. Oh no, Dr. Wixall breathed. She's turned the entire arena into a... The explosion was magnificent. The cascade, or advanced problem-solving in action. Cassidy had somehow managed to turn the arena's own construction into a cascading structural failure that brought down a quarter of the urban environment directly on top of the three Guardians. The spider tank was caught directly under a falling building and disappeared in a cloud of debris and sparks. The humanoid Guardian managed to avoid the primary collapse but found itself trapped under a beam that must have weighed several tons. The organic Guardian was fast enough to avoid the falling debris, but Cassidy was already moving. She emerged from her cover as the dust was still settling, sprinting across the rubble with the kind of sure-footed confidence that comes from having planned every step. She reached the trapped humanoid Guardian first. Its weapon systems were pinned, but its defensive systems were still active. Should have been impregnable. Cassidy climbed onto its chest, looked directly at what I assumed was its primary sensor array, and said, "Sorry about this, but I've got a schedule to keep." Then she drove her knife directly into what appeared to be a maintenance access panel that was probably not supposed to be a critical vulnerability. The Guardian went dark. The organic Guardian had freed itself from the debris and was moving to intercept her. But Cassidy was already gone, vanishing into the maze of rubble with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested she'd mapped every possible movement route before bringing the building down. When she reappeared, she was behind the organic Guardian, and she was no longer carrying just a knife. Somehow, during the 30 seconds she'd been out of sight, she'd managed to salvage components from the disabled Guardians and fashion them into what looked like an improvised energy weapon. "I really hate to do this," she called out to the remaining Guardian, "because you guys are actually pretty impressive pieces of engineering. But I've got a feeling this whole situation is about to get a lot more complicated, and I'd rather have it be complicated with me holding the biggest stick." The organic Guardian spun to face her, its own weapons charging for what was clearly intended to be a decisive final strike. Cassidy's improvised weapon fired first. The beam that emerged was not supposed to be possible. According to everything I knew about energy weapon design, you can't just cobble together components from different systems and expect them to function, let alone function better than the original designs. The beam punched through the organic Guardian's defensive systems like they were made of paper, and the construct collapsed in a shower of sparks and what might have been biomechanical gore. Total elapsed time for Wave 3, 57 minutes. Guardian entities neutralized, 3. Human casualties, 0. Structural damage to the arena, extensive. Damage to the collective ego of galactic civilization, incalculable. Hour 3. The Reckoning. Or, when reality comes knocking. The silence in the observation deck was the kind that happens when a large group of highly intelligent beings simultaneously realizes that everything they thought they knew about the universe was wrong. Cassidy stood in the middle of the destroyed arena, still holding her improvised superweapon, looking like she'd just finished a moderately challenging crossword puzzle. "So," she called up to the observation deck, "I'm guessing that was your final boss scenario?" Curator Vexoth made a sound that his translator couldn't process. "Because if it was," Cassidy continued, "I hate to break it to you, but your difficulty scaling needs some work. That was definitely more challenging than the first 2 waves, but honestly, my training scenarios back home are usually harder than this." She looked around at the smoking ruins of what had been the galaxy's most advanced combat environment. "Don't get me wrong," she added. "The adaptive AI on those last 3 was really impressive, and whoever designed that structural integration system for the urban environment obviously knows their stuff. But the fundamental problem is that you're thinking like engineers instead of soldiers. In the observation deck, the draconian military attaché was making notes with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire worldview was being rewritten in real time. "You built your scenarios to be impressive," Cassidy continued, apparently enjoying her impromptu lecture. "Big weapons, fancy armor, overwhelming firepower. Very dramatic. But you didn't build them to be unpredictable." She gestured at the remains of the Spider Tank Guardian. "That thing had enough firepower to level a city block, but it was completely dependent on its targeting systems. Disrupt the sensors and all that firepower becomes useless." Classic over-engineering problem. She pointed at where the humanoid Guardian had fallen. That one had better tactical adaptability, but its designers were so focused on making it versatile that they forgot to armor the maintenance access points. Great for field repairs, terrible for combat survivability. Finally, she indicated the collapsed organic Guardian. And that last one was probably the most dangerous, because it actually seemed to have genuine intelligence rather than just advanced programming. But it was overconfident. Assumed that its superior technology would guarantee victory. Never considered that the primitive opponent might be able to reverse engineer and weaponize components from its allies. She looked up at the observation deck with what I was beginning to recognize as her teaching expression. "The thing is," she said, "where I come from, we don't build our training scenarios to be fair. We build them to be educational. The goal isn't to win, it's to learn something new about how to survive when everything goes wrong." She held up her improvised weapon. "And what I've learned from this exercise is that your technology is really impressive, but your tactical doctrine has some significant gaps. You're fighting like you expect your opponents to play by your rules." The pause that followed was pregnant with implications. "Where I come from," Cassidy concluded, "we don't have rules. We have objectives. The negotiation. Or how to end an interstellar incident before it gets worse." It took another hour for the various bureaucrats and military observers to work up the courage to actually go down to the arena level and talk to Cassidy face to face. When they finally did, they came in force, a full diplomatic delegation protected by energy shields and accompanied by enough security personnel to invade a small planet. Cassidy had spent the intervening time exploring the arena's wreckage with what appeared to be professional curiosity. When the delegation arrived, she was sitting on a piece of rubble, methodically disassembling her improvised weapon and apparently taking notes on its construction. The conversation that followed was the galaxy's first official diplomatic contact with humanity, conducted in the ruins of an arena where a single human soldier had just demonstrated why her species was not to be underestimated. What the delegation learned over the next several hours was both fascinating and terrifying. Humans, it turned out, were not the primitive species they'd been mistaken for. They were a Class 12 Deathworld species that had spent their entire evolutionary history engaged in competitive technological advancement driven by perpetual warfare. They had militarized space. They considered their kidnapped soldiers' performance to be basic competency, and they were currently trying to contact her to find out where she was. The formal negotiations lasted 3 days and resulted in what would become known as the Arena Accords, the foundational treaty governing human-galactic relations. The humans proved to be remarkably reasonable negotiators, demanding only respect and proper diplomatic protocols for future contact. They also included a clause that any future scientific assessments of human capabilities would be conducted with proper prior consent and appropriate safety measures. The clause was officially known as the Informed Consent Protocol. Unofficially, it became known as the Don't Poke the Deathworlders Amendment. Epilogue. 6 months later. Or, How the Galaxy Learned to Stop Worrying and Respect the Humans. I was back in my office on Rigel Station, filing my final report on the arena incident when the communication came through. The Galactic Council wanted a follow-up assessment on human integration into galactic society. It had been an interesting 6 months. The humans, as promised, had proven to be remarkably reasonable neighbors. They'd established trade routes with 17 different species, contributed to 3 separate peacekeeping missions, and had even helped resolve a border dispute between the Andromedans and the Centauri Collective through what they called aggressive mediation. They'd also revolutionized galactic military doctrine, though not in the way anyone had expected. "The thing about humans," I dictated to my recording device, "is that they don't fight the way we expected them to fight. They don't overwhelm you with superior technology or devastating firepower. They solve problems." I paused, remembering Cassidy Brooks sitting in that arena, calmly explaining to a room full of terrified academics why their 1,000-year military engineering project had failed to last an hour against a single soldier with a knife. When faced with 3 waves of progressively more dangerous opponents, I continued, Lieutenant Brooks didn't try to overpower them. She analyzed them, identified their weaknesses, and exploited those weaknesses with whatever tools were available. When those tools proved insufficient, she created better tools from the wreckage of her enemies. I pulled up the technical analysis that Dr. Wixall had eventually completed on Cassidy's improvised weapon. The efficiency ratings were still giving the engineering department's nightmares. This appears to be characteristic of human problem-solving methodology, I noted. They don't ask, how do we build something strong enough to win? They ask, how do we win with what we have? The distinction is significant. The communication alert chimed, and I found myself looking at the familiar face of Ambassador Keltar, who had somehow managed to parlay his experience with the arena incident into a promotion to Chief Human Liaison. Dr. Zexhai, he said. Good to see you again. I trust your report is progressing well? Indeed, I replied. Though I have to say, the humans continue to surprise me. In what way? I gestured at the data screens around my office, which were currently displaying shipping manifests, diplomatic correspondence, and what appeared to be blueprints for some kind of joint human galactic engineering project. They're not conquerors, I said. They're collaborators. They don't want to replace our technology. They want to improve it. They don't want to dominate our space. They want to explore beyond it. Ambassador Keltar nodded thoughtfully. The Cultural Contact Division has reached similar conclusions, though I understand there have been some incidents. I called up the relevant files. There had indeed been incidents. The Draconian Empire had decided to test human resolve by conducting aggressive reconnaissance near one of their outer colonies. The humans had responded by politely requesting that the Draconians cease their activities, then demonstrating their own reconnaissance capabilities by providing the Draconian High Command with detailed blueprints of their newest battleships, along with a list of suggested improvements. The Draconians had immediately ceased their reconnaissance activities and formally requested a technological exchange program. The Zephyrian Academic Collective had attempted to conduct unauthorized studies of human psychology by infiltrating their communication networks. The humans had detected the intrusion within hours, traced it back to its source, and then helpfully provided the collective with a complete analysis of their own cybersecurity vulnerabilities along with recommendations for improvement. The collective had immediately ceased their unauthorized studies and formally requested a joint research program. The pattern was becoming clear. They don't respond to challenges with force, I noted. They respond with competence. They don't try to intimidate. They demonstrate capability. It's effective. Perhaps too effective, Ambassador Keltar mused. The Military Council is concerned that human integration is proceeding too rapidly. Some species are beginning to feel inadequate. I understood the concern. When your entire military doctrine is suddenly rendered obsolete by a single human lieutenant with a knife and an hour of free time, it tends to create some psychological adjustment issues. Have there been any requests for military assistance? I asked. 17 so far, Ambassador Keltar replied. Everything from border security consulting to full strategic alliance proposals. The humans have been diplomatic in their responses. I called up the relevant files. The humans had indeed been diplomatic. They'd offered training programs, technological exchanges, and strategic consulting. What they hadn't offered was direct military intervention. They're not trying to become the galaxy's policemen, I observed. They're trying to make sure we don't need policemen. Is that necessarily a good thing? I considered the question carefully. In the 6 months since first contact, galactic military spending had decreased by 30%, while defensive capabilities had increased by nearly 200%. 3 separate border conflicts had been resolved through negotiation rather than warfare, and the overall level of interspecies cooperation had reached levels not seen since the formation of the Galactic Council itself. I think, I said finally, that it depends on whether you prefer living in a galaxy where everyone is afraid of each other, or living in a galaxy where everyone is too busy solving problems together to have time for warfare. Ambassador Keltar was quiet for a moment. Dr. Zexhai, he said finally, in your professional opinion, what would happen if humanity decided to withdraw from galactic society? To return to their own space and cease all contact with the rest of us? I thought about Cassidy Brooks, sitting in that arena, patiently explaining to a room full of academics why their assumptions about primitive species had been so catastrophically wrong. I thought about Commander Wells, conducting first contact negotiations with the kind of professional competence that made it clear humanity had been preparing for this moment for centuries. I thought about the human engineers who were currently helping to redesign the galactic defense grid, the human merchants who were revolutionizing interstellar trade, the human scientists who were asking questions that nobody else had thought to ask. I think, I said, that would be a very bad thing for the rest of us. And if they decided to take a more active role in galactic affairs, I thought about the shipping manifests showing human military vessels conducting joint exercises with species that had been enemies for centuries. I thought about the diplomatic reports describing human negotiators resolving conflicts that had lasted for decades. I thought about the technological analyses showing human innovations that were making everyone's lives better. I think, I said, that would probably be a very good thing for the rest of us. Ambassador Keltar smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the arena incident. Dr. HFY, he said, I think the galaxy is going to be a very interesting place. Final assessment, or what we learned from poking the Deathworlders. I finished my report later that evening, as the twin sons of Rigel were setting through the observation ports of my office. The final assessment was comprehensive, detailed, and contained recommendations that would probably shape galactic policy for the next century. But the most important part, the part that would be quoted in history books and diplomatic manuals for generations to come, was surprisingly simple. Humanity represents a paradigm shift in galactic civilization. They are not the strongest species we have encountered, nor the most technologically advanced, nor the most numerous, but they may be the most important. They have shown us that the questions we've been asking, how do we become more powerful? How do we defeat our enemies? How do we protect what we have? Are the wrong questions. The right questions are, how do we solve problems together? How do we turn enemies into allies? How do we build something better than what we have? Humanity doesn't just fight wars, they end them. They don't just survive in hostile environments, they make them livable. They don't just solve their own problems, they help everyone else solve theirs. The arena incident was not a demonstration of human military superiority. It was a demonstration of human problem-solving methodology applied to what they perceived as a tactical scenario. The fact that they succeeded so completely tells us less about their combat capabilities and more about their approach to challenges in general. When faced with overwhelming odds and superior technology, they don't surrender. They adapt. When confronted with problems they don't understand, they learn. When presented with enemies, they find ways to turn them into allies. This is not a species that will conquer the galaxy. This is a species that will fix it. I saved the file and transmitted it to the Galactic Council, then leaned back in my chair to watch the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, human ships were patrolling trade routes that had been pirate-infested for decades. Human engineers were designing defense systems that would protect worlds they'd never seen. Human diplomats were negotiating peace treaties between species that had been fighting since before Earth's sun had ignited. And somewhere, probably, another human lieutenant was solving someone else's problems with whatever tools happened to be available. The galaxy had definitely become a more interesting place. As I was preparing to leave for the evening, my communication system chimed one final time. The message was brief, informal, and came from an unexpected source. Dr. HFY, read your preliminary report on human integration. Excellent work. If you're ever interested in seeing how we actually conduct training exercises, you're welcome to visit our facility on Luna. Fair warning, it's more challenging than the arena scenarios, but also more educational. Lieutenant K. Brooks, Human Expeditionary Force. I stared at the message for a long moment, then composed my reply. Lieutenant Brooks, thank you for the invitation. I would be honored to observe your training methods, though I suspect I'll need to update my insurance policies first. Dr. HFY. Her response came back almost immediately. Don't worry, Doc. We'll start you off with something easy. Maybe a basic survival scenario or a simple tactical puzzle. We save the really dangerous stuff for people who ask for it specifically. KB. I looked out at the stars again, thinking about a species that considered gladiatorial combat against military-grade war machines a basic competency test, and wondering what they might consider really dangerous stuff. Then I updated my insurance policies and booked passage to the Sol system. After all, if you're going to study Deathworlders, you might as well learn from the best. End. Commander Vexthul of the Korvani Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship, the World Render, watching the third planet of this unremarkable yellow star system with what could generously be called professional interest. His 6 eyes, each the size of a dinner plate, tracked the primitive electromagnetic emissions bleeding from the planet's surface like cosmic static. Sir, his tactical officer, a particularly nervous specimen named Zektar, approached with the kind of careful steps one uses around a fusion reactor having a bad day. The scans are, well, they're complete. Vexthul's mandibles twitched. Not clicked, because he wasn't some backwater insectoid who made annoying noises when thinking. No, The Korvani were apex predators from Korvan Prime, a world where the grass could dissolve steel, and the morning dew was technically classified as a Class 3 bioweapon. They were 2.5 meters of muscle, chitin, and barely contained violence wrapped in military doctrine. And? Vexthal's voice carried the kind of patient menace that made junior officers check their life insurance policies. The inhabitants call themselves humans, sir. They're from a Deathworld. Now, this should have been cause for concern. In the galactic community, Deathworld species were taken seriously. When your planet actively tries to murder you from birth, you either evolve into something impressively dangerous or you become extinct. There's really no middle ground. But Vexthal had been conquering species for the better part of 2 centuries. He'd faced the crystal-shelled Zephyrians, whose homeworld had gravity that could crush starships. He'd subdued the Pyroclast Collective, who literally breathed molten metal. Hell, he'd even beaten the Void Singers, and they didn't even have physical forms half the time. So when he looked at the tactical display showing a species that had barely figured out how to leave their own gravity well, his response was underwhelming. Deathworld, you say? He examined a claw with the kind of studied indifference that would make a therapist rich. How delightfully quaint. What's their primary threat classification? Zekdar consulted his datapad with shaking appendages. Carbon-based. Bilateral symmetry. Average height 1.7 meters. Single-star binary sensory organs. No natural armor, claws, or apparent toxin secretion systems. There was a pause that stretched longer than a Korvani winter. I'm sorry, Vexthal said slowly. Did you just describe a species that sounds like it couldn't survive a particularly aggressive houseplant from our homeworld? Yes, sir. But sir, they are technically classified as Deathworld. Yes, you mentioned that. Vexthal waved a dismissive claw. I'm sure their planet has some moderately inconvenient weather patterns. Perhaps it rains occasionally. What Commander Vexthal didn't know, what none of the Korvani knew, really, was that they were about to discover the fundamental difference between being the apex predator of your world and being a species that had to become the apex predator of a world that was actively trying to kill them with creative enthusiasm. See, Korvan Prime was certainly dangerous, but it was dangerous in predictable ways. The acid grass grew in specific regions. The predators hunted according to instinct. The environmental hazards were, well, environmental. Earth, on the other hand, was dangerous the way a cosmic practical joke is dangerous. You never see it coming, and when you do, you're too busy being horrified to laugh. 3 hours later, the first wave of Korvani drop pods screamed through Earth's atmosphere like particularly aggressive meteorites. Each pod contained a full squad of Korvani shock troops, beings who had conquered 14 worlds and considered overkill a quaint concept for species that lacked imagination. Squad leader Thaxmore kicked open his pod door and stepped onto what appeared to be a perfectly reasonable piece of terrain. Rolling hills covered in green vegetation, a few scattered structures in the distance, and a pleasant yellow star overhead. It was almost disappointingly pastoral. "Command, this is Alpha Squad," he reported into his comm unit. "Landing successful. No immediate hostiles visible. Proceeding to..." That's when he noticed the small bipedal figure standing about 50 meters away, apparently having a conversation with what looked like a domesticated quadruped. The human, because that's what it obviously was, turned toward the squad of 2.5-meter armored killing machines that had just crash-landed in what Thaxmore now realized was probably some kind of agricultural area. Did the human run? Did it scream? Did it call for backup or assume a defensive posture? No, it waved. "Morning," the human called out cheerfully. "You folks having car trouble?" Thaxmore's squad exchanged glances. They'd prepared for screaming, for weapons fire, for desperate last stands against technologically superior invaders. They had not prepared for politeness. "We are the Korvani Empire," Thaxmore announced, drawing himself up to his full impressive height. "You will surrender immediately or face the consequences." The human, a male specimen with graying hair and what appeared to be some kind of agricultural work clothing, considered this statement with the gravity it deserved. "Well," he said finally, "that's a hell of a thing. I'm Jim, by the way. This here's my dog, Buster." He gestured to the quadruped, which had apparently decided that aliens were just another type of visitor, and was wagging its tail accordingly. You... Thaxmore found himself in uncharted conversational territory. "We are here to conquer your world." "Ah," Jim nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like something for the government to handle. I just grow corn." He paused. "You want some water? You look like you might be overheating in all that armor." And that's how the first contact between humanity and the mighty Korvani Empire began, with a farmer offering them refreshments. Back on the world render, Commander Vexthal was experiencing what military analysts would later describe as cognitive disconnect. His tactical display showed his drop pods had landed successfully. His troops were reporting no casualties, and yet somehow, nobody seemed to be conquering anything. "Squad leader Thaxmore," he growled into the comm. "What's your status?" Sir, we've made contact with a local. He's offered us lemonade." Vexthal's mandibles twitched. "Come again?" "Lemonade, sir. It's apparently a local beverage, made from citrus fruits. He says it's good for hot days." There was a long pause during which Vexthal contemplated the various ways the universe seemed determined to make his life difficult. "Squad leader," he said with the kind of calm that preceded executions. "Are you telling me that instead of conquering the local population, you're having a beverage social?" "Well, sir, we tried the conquering thing, but he said that was above his pay grade, and we should probably talk to someone in Washington. He drew us a map." Vexthal looked at his tactical officer, who was doing his best impression of furniture. "Zektar." "Yes, sir?" "Remind me why we classified this as a Deathworld species." Zektar consulted his files with renewed desperation. "Well, sir, according to our xenobiology reports, their homeworld has— Oh my. What?" "Sir, their planet is covered in dihydrogen monoxide." "So?" "In liquid form, sir, at standard temperature and pressure." Vexthal blinked several eyes in sequence. That's impossible." Dihydrogen monoxide is one of the most corrosive substances in the known galaxy. It dissolves metal, erodes stone, and can kill most carbon-based life forms through osmotic pressure differential. "Yes, sir. They call it water and they drink it." "They drink it?" "Approximately 60% of their body mass is composed of it, sir." There was another of those pauses that seemed to be becoming a theme. "Continue reading," Vexthal said weakly. "Their atmosphere is 21% oxygen, sir." "Oxygen? The combustion accelerant?" "Yes, sir. They breathe it. Continuously." "And, sir?" "What now?" "Their planet orbits within the blast radius of a Class G fusion reactor." Vexthal sat down heavily in his command chair. "You mean their star?" "Yes, sir. And they seem to enjoy it. They have something called beaches where they deliberately expose themselves to the radiation for recreational purposes." "Recreational purposes. They call it tanning, sir." Commander Vexthal, conqueror of 14 worlds, veteran of the Zephyrian Wars, and generally considered one of the most dangerous beings in this spiral arm of the galaxy, put his head in his claws. "Get me a full environmental analysis of this Earth," he said finally. "I have a feeling we've made a terrible mistake." While the Korvani command structure was having its existential crisis, Jim the farmer was giving squad leader Thaxmore and his troops what amounted to an impromptu tour of rural Kansas. "Now, you see that over there?" Jim pointed to a structure that looked innocuous enough. "That's my storm cellar. Built it myself after the last tornado took out the old one." "Tornado?" Thaxmore asked with the kind of casual interest that suggested he definitely didn't want to know the answer. "Oh yeah, we get those pretty regular around here. Winds up to 300 miles per hour, pick up houses and cars, throw them around like toys. Had one last spring that was near a mile wide." Jim said this with the same tone most people use to discuss mildly inconvenient weather. 300 miles per hour? One of Thaxmore's troopers, a young soldier named Kixnal, squeaked. "Give or take. Weather service tracks them pretty good these days, though. Usually get plenty of warning." Jim scratched his head thoughtfully. "Of course, sometimes they change direction without much notice. Nature's funny that way." Thaxmore's squad was beginning to understand why their homeworld's Category 4 windstorms suddenly seemed quaint. "But surely," Thaxmore said, grasping for some semblance of normalcy, "your species has adapted to avoid these tornadoes?" Jim laughed. "Avoid 'em? Hell no. Got a whole industry built around chasing the damn things. Storm chasers, they call themselves. Drive right up to 'em with cameras and scientific equipment. Some folks do it just for fun." "Fun?" Thaxmore repeated. "Sure. Pretty impressive sight, I'll give you that. Nothing quite like watching a F5 tornado tear up the landscape. Beautiful in its way." Jim paused. "Oh, and speaking of weather, looks like we might get some hail later." "Hail?" "Ice chunks falling from the sky. Sometimes big as golf balls, sometimes big as baseballs. Had some a few years back that were big as grapefruits. Put holes right through car hoods." Cheeksnell was furiously taking notes on his tactical pad, apparently trying to update the threat assessment in real time. "But the ice chunks," he managed. "Surely you have protective shelters." "Well, sure, if you're caught outside. But mostly we just wait it out. Insurance covers the damage usually." Jim shrugged. "Part of living on Earth, you know. Can't let the weather run your life." That's when they heard the distant rumble of thunder. "Ah," Jim said, glancing at the sky. "Right on schedule. You boys might want to come inside. This looks like it might be a good one. The good one turned out to be what meteorologists would classify as a severe thunderstorm, which in human terms meant impressive but not particularly noteworthy, and in Korvani terms meant nature's attempt at orbital bombardment. From inside Jim's farmhouse, Thaxmore and his squad watched through reinforced windows as the sky turned the color of fresh bruises and began hurling electricity at the ground with the kind of casual violence that made their homeworld's lightning storms look like camera flashes. "That's a nice one," Jim observed, watching a lightning bolt strike a tree about 100 meters away. The tree exploded into splinters. "Good conductor oak always gets hit first." The electrical discharge," Thaxmore said, his voice carefully controlled. "It appears to have a power output of several million volts." "Sounds about right," Jim agreed. "Lightning's pretty impressive stuff. We've learned to work with it, though. Guy named Franklin figured out how to redirect it safely with lightning rods. That was, couple hundred years ago. You've weaponized atmospheric electrical discharge?" "Well, no, not weaponized exactly. More like domesticated it. We use lightning rods to protect buildings, and we've learned to harness electrical energy for power." Kicksnall was updating his threat assessment again. At this rate, he was going to need a bigger data pad. Outside, the wind picked up to what Jim casually referred to as gusty, and what the Korvani environmental sensors registered as potentially lethal to anything not secured to bedrock. "Course," Jim continued conversationally. "This is nothing compared to what they get down south during hurricane season." "Hurricane season?" Thaxmore asked with the kind of resigned dread usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "Oh yeah, hurricanes make this look like a gentle breeze. Winds up to 200 miles per hour, storm surge that can flood entire coastal regions, rain measured in feet instead of inches. They get names and everything." "Names? Sure. This year we're up to... let's see. Think the last one was Hurricane Patricia. She was a Category 5. Tore up the Gulf Coast pretty good before she moved inland and got downgraded. Your species names these atmospheric warfare events? Makes it easier to track them. Plus, gives the weather folks something to do during the off-season." Jim paused thoughtfully. "Though I suppose calling it an off-season isn't quite right. We get different kinds of storms year-round. Blizzards in winter, tornadoes in spring and summer, hurricanes in fall. Ice storms, derechos, microbursts. Microbursts? Downdrafts that'll slam aircraft right into the ground. Tricky things." Thaxmore was beginning to suspect that their tactical briefings had been somewhat inadequate. "But surely," he said desperately, "your species has evolved some kind of natural defense against these environmental hazards." Jim looked at him with genuine confusion. "Defense? Why would we need defenses?" "Because your planet is trying to kill you." "Well, sure," Jim said reasonably, "but that's what makes it interesting." Commander Vexthul was having what could diplomatically be described as a very bad day. The full environmental analysis of Earth had arrived, and it read like a horror novel written by a particularly creative xenobiologist with a sadistic streak. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said to his increasingly nervous science officer. "This planet regularly experiences atmospheric pressure differentials that create wind speeds capable of destroying spacecraft?" "Yes, sir. They call them hurricanes, tornadoes, and typhoons, depending on location and rotational characteristics." "And these occur naturally?" "Yes, sir. Seasonally in most cases. The inhabitants have developed prediction systems and simply adapt their activities accordingly." Vexthul felt a headache coming on. "Continue." "The planet's surface is subject to regular bombardment by frozen precipitation of various sizes, some capable of causing significant structural damage." "Frozen precipitation?" "Hail, sir. Water that freezes in the upper atmosphere and falls at terminal velocity. Some specimens have been recorded at over 20 centimeters in diameter. 20-centimeter ice projectiles falling from the sky, naturally." "Yes, sir. The locals consider anything under 5 centimeters to be minor hail." Vexthul made a note to have his medical officer check his cardiac rhythm. "What else?" "The planet's crust is geologically active, sir. It experiences regular seismic events that can level cities." "Earthquakes?" "Yes, sir. And volcanic activity that can alter planetary climate patterns. Also, the planet is 71% covered in the dihydrogen monoxide we mentioned earlier. The corrosive substance they drink." "Yes, sir. But it gets worse." "This liquid regularly forms atmospheric suspension and falls from the sky. Rain. Sometimes quite heavily, sir. They measure it in inches or centimeters of accumulation. Some regions receive over 400 inches per year." Vexthul closed his eyes. "Is there more?" "Well, sir, there's the wildlife. Please tell me the wildlife is at least reasonable." "I'm afraid not, sir." They share their planet with something called polar bears, which are apparently 2-meter-tall predators that can run 60 kilometers per hour and swim in the liquid dihydrogen monoxide. They swim in acid, the bears do, yes. But so do the humans, sir, recreationally. Of course they do. And then there are the sharks, sir. I don't want to know. Aquatic predators with rows of serrated teeth, some specimens reaching lengths of over 6 meters. And the humans? They call it swimming with sharks, and consider it a recreational activity. Vexthal looked out at the blue-green planet hanging in the view screen, and tried to understand how evolution had produced a species that not only survived on this nightmare world, but actually seemed to enjoy it. Sir, his communications officer called out, we're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. From our troops? No, sir. From the humans. It appears to be directed at us. On screen. I'm Rebecca Morrison with Channel 7 News, and we're here with breaking coverage of what appears to be humanity's first contact with an extraterrestrial species. Vexthal stared. They're broadcasting this? It appears so, sir. To their entire planet? Yes, sir. Multiple networks, in fact. This seems to be considered news. On the screen, the human continued. We go now to our field reporter, Dave Kowalski, who's on the scene in rural Kansas where the first contact occurred. Dave? The image shifted to show another human standing in what appeared to be the same agricultural area where Thaxmore's squad had landed. In the background, Vexthal could clearly see his elite shock troops, sitting on what appeared to be primitive furniture, drinking beverages from cylindrical containers. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm here with Jim Henderson, the local farmer who first made contact with our visitors, and squad leader. Could you pronounce that again for our viewers? Thaxmore, came the familiar voice of his squad leader, who appeared to be entirely too comfortable with this situation. Right, Thaxmore of the Korvani Empire. Now, Jim, what was your first reaction when you saw these, spacecraft land in your field? Jim appeared on screen, looking exactly as relaxed as someone discussing the weather. Well, Dave, first thing I thought was, there goes my South 40. Those pods made quite an impression when they came down, but hell, I've seen worse damage from hailstorms. And Thaxmore, what has surprised you most about Earth so far? Thaxmore's image filled the screen. Even through the translation matrix, Vexthal could hear the bewilderment in his voice. Your species lives on a planet that regularly attempts to kill you with frozen water projectiles, atmospheric pressure weapons, and geological instability. And you consider this normal. Well, Dave said with the kind of casual laugh that made Vexthal's mandibles twitch. It's home, right? You adapt. That evening, as the storm passed and the sun set over Kansas in a display of colors that the Korvani sensors registered as atmospheric particle refraction caused by electromagnetic radiation interacting with suspended moisture. Squad leader Thaxmore found himself in a situation that no military training had prepared him for. He was having dinner with a human family. Jim had insisted, of course. Can't let visitors go hungry, he'd said, as if feeding potential invaders was just common courtesy. And somehow, Thaxmore had found himself and his squad sitting around a table that was definitely not designed for beings of their size, attempting to navigate human social customs while consuming what Jim assured them was good home cooking. The food itself was tolerable, apparently safe for consumption by carbon-based life forms, though the humans seemed to have an inexplicable fondness for adding various chemical compounds for flavor. They called it seasoning, though Thaxmore suspected it was really just a form of low-level chemical warfare against their own taste receptors. So, said Jim's mate, Linda, he'd introduced her as, passing around a bowl of something called mashed potatoes. What's your home planet like? Thaxmore found himself in the bizarre position of trying to describe Korvan Prime to beings who considered living on a world that regularly tried to murder them to be perfectly reasonable. Korvan Prime is stable, he said finally. The weather patterns are predictable. The geology is sound. The wildlife, while dangerous, follows logical behavioral patterns. Sounds boring, commented their offspring. A small human named Tyler, who apparently wasn't old enough to understand that commenting on alien homeworlds might be considered impolite. Tyler, Linda scolded, but Jim just laughed. Boy's got a point. Predictable's nice for some things, but where's the adventure in that? Adventure? Thaxmore asked. Sure. Half the fun of living on Earth is not knowing what Mother Nature's going to throw at you next. Keeps life interesting. Thaxmore looked around the table at these beings who had somehow built a civilization on a planet that seemed designed by a cosmic sadist. and slowly began to understand something that the Korvani Empire xenobiologists had missed entirely. They weren't just surviving on their death world. They were thriving on it. "Jim," he said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Shoot." "When your weather prediction systems tell you that a tornado is approaching, what do you do?" "Well, depends on the size and where it's headed. If it's coming this way, we head for the storm cellar and wait it out. If it's not, we might drive over and watch it from a safe distance. Tornadoes are pretty impressive. You observe them?" "Sure. Nature's putting on a show. Might as well enjoy it." Thaxmore was quiet for a moment. "On Corvin Prime," he said finally. "When our storms come, we retreat to underground shelters and wait for them to pass. We consider survival to be the primary objective." "Well, survival's important," Jim agreed. "But what's the point of surviving if you don't live a little?" That's when Thaxmore began to suspect that the Korvani Empire might have seriously underestimated humanity. Commander Vexthul was coming to the same conclusion, though his realization was being assisted by a steady stream of reports from his various landing parties that read like dispatches from an alternate universe. Squad leader Crixnall reported that his unit had landed near something called Yellowstone National Park, where the humans had apparently built recreational facilities directly on top of active volcanic features that could sterilize continents. "They have walkways, sir." Crixnall's voice carried a note of stunned disbelief. "Constructed walkways that allow tourists to observe geothermal vents that could melt our battle armor." "Tourists?" "Recreational visitors, sir. They bring small offspring and photographic equipment. Some of them complained that we were blocking their view of the sulfur springs." Squad leader Nexoth had landed near something called Death Valley, which lived up to its name by maintaining surface temperatures that could kill most galactic species through thermal shock. "Sir, the humans here engage in something called hiking," she reported. "They deliberately expose themselves to lethal temperatures while carrying their own water supplies and wearing minimal protection." "Why?" "When I asked, sir, they said it was fun and good exercise." But it was squad leader Yixmar's report that finally convinced Vexthul that humanity was operating on a completely different level of cosmic insanity. "Sir, I've landed near something called Mount Everest." "And?" "It's a geological formation that extends 8.8 kilometers above sea level, sir. The atmospheric pressure is insufficient to sustain most life forms, the temperature is well below freezing, and the environmental conditions are uniformly hostile." "Naturally, and the humans avoid it?" "No, sir, they climb it." "They what?" "Climb it, sir. On foot. For recreation. There's apparently a waiting list." Vexthul stared at the tactical display showing his crack military units scattered across a planet where the recreational activities would be classified as suicide missions on any civilized world. "Tactical," he called out. "Yes, sir?" "What's our current strategic assessment?" Zektar consulted his instruments with the air of someone who is seriously considering a career change. "Well, sir, we've successfully landed 12 squads across various regions of the planet. And they're all having dinner with local families, sir." "Dinner?" "Yes, sir. Squad leader Wixdal reports that he's learning something called barbecue techniques from a human in Texas. Squad leader Zixanon is apparently helping repair storm damage in Florida. And squad leader Kexthar." Zektar paused. "What about Kexthar?" He's signed up for something called skydiving lessons, sir." "Skydiving?" "Apparently humans deliberately jump out of aircraft at high altitude for entertainment, sir." Vexthul closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd thought conquering Earth was a good idea. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving another transmission from the surface." "More news broadcasts?" "No, sir. This appears to be from their governmental authority. They're requesting a formal diplomatic meeting." "Diplomatic?" "Yes, sir. They've offered to send a representative to negotiate what they're calling first contact protocols." Vexthul looked at the planet spinning peacefully below them, its surface covered in beings who apparently considered cosmic-level environmental hazards to be minor inconveniences and potential entertainment. "Very well," he said finally. "Arrange the meeting, but keep the ship at full combat readiness." "Sir, do you really think that's necessary?" Vexthul watched another lightning storm dance across the planet's night side, each bolt carrying enough energy to power a small city. "With this species," he said grimly, "I'm not taking any chances." The human diplomatic representative arrived in a spacecraft that violated several fundamental principles of engineering and at least 3 laws of physics. It was primitive, inefficient, and held together with what appeared to be controlled explosions and stubborn determination. It was also, Vexthul had to admit, rather impressive in its own way. The human who emerged from the docking bay was not what he'd expected. She was small, even by human standards apparently, with graying hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything the universe had to offer, and wasn't particularly impressed by most of it. "Commander Vexthal, I presume?" she said, extending one of her small, unarmored appendages. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, head of the United Nations First Contact Committee." "First Contact Committee?" Vexthal asked, carefully manipulating his much larger claw to avoid accidentally crushing the delicate human appendage. "We established it about 50 years ago," she said matter-of-factly. "Figured it was only a matter of time before someone showed up. Coffee?" What? "Coffee. Stimulant beverage. Helps with long negotiations." She was already moving toward what appeared to be a small preparation area. "Or tea, if you prefer. Though I should warn you, Earth beverages can be pretty potent for species that aren't used to them." Vexthal watched this small human casually preparing refreshments aboard a warship that could sterilize continents, and tried to understand how someone so apparently fragile could seem so completely unimpressed. "Dr. Reyes," he said carefully, "are you not concerned about your current situation?" "Concerned?" She looked up from her beverage preparation with genuine curiosity. "Why would I be concerned?" "You are aboard an alien vessel, surrounded by beings who came here with the intention of conquering your world." "Ah." She nodded thoughtfully. "Well, first, Jim Henderson's already given your people a pretty good introduction to Earth hospitality, so the conquering thing seems to be off the table. Second, I spent 20 years as a diplomat in the Middle East, so it takes more than alien invaders to rattle me these days." "The Middle East?" "Region on Earth where humans regularly attempt to resolve complex political situations through a combination of negotiation, cultural exchange, and occasional violence. Good training for this sort of thing, actually." She handed him a steaming cup of something that smelled like it could strip paint. "Now, let's talk about why you're really here." Vexthal accepted the beverage with the kind of caution normally reserved for handling unstable explosives. "We are the Korvani Empire. You're explorers," she interrupted gently. "Looking for new worlds, new species, new challenges. The conquest thing is just because you haven't found anything interesting enough to be worth talking to instead of fighting." That's not..." Vexthal paused. "How did you..." "Commander, you've got what, 12 squads on the surface? All of them equipped for planetary assault? And instead of launching a coordinated attack, they're having dinner with farm families and learning local customs. That's not the behavior of conquerors. That's the behavior of people who've finally found something they've never seen before." Vexthal found himself in the unusual position of having his species' entire military philosophy dissected by a being whose own species considered jumping out of aircraft to be recreational. "You think you understand us," he said. "Not yet," she admitted. "But I understand the look in your people's eyes when they talk about Earth. It's the same look humans get when they see something that shouldn't be possible but is anyway." She sipped her beverage. "Like a species that builds cities on fault lines and considers hurricanes to be seasonal entertainment. Your world is insane." "Our world is interesting," she corrected. "Yours sounds stable, predictable, safe. That's got to get boring after a while." Vexthal found himself actually considering this. Corvin Prime was indeed stable, predictable, safe. It was a good world for building a civilization, for raising offspring, for creating an empire that could span star systems. But interesting? "What are you proposing?" he asked. Dr. Reyes smiled, and Vexthal suddenly understood why humanity had survived on a world that regularly tried to kill them. It wasn't just adaptability or stubbornness, though they had both in abundance. It was optimism. The kind of cosmic-level optimism that looked at a planet covered in natural disasters and deadly wildlife and said, "Let's build something amazing here." "Cultural exchange," she said. "Your people are clearly fascinated by Earth. Our people are fascinated by, well, everything beyond Earth. You've got technology we can barely imagine. We've got perspectives on survival and adaptation that might surprise you. You want us to stay? I want us to learn from each other." She leaned forward. "Commander, your people are apex predators from a stable world. But what happens when an apex predator meets a species that became apex through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up?" Vexthal looked out through the viewport at the swirling storms of Earth's atmosphere, and thought about his troops sitting around human dinner tables, learning about tornadoes and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that the locals considered minor inconveniences. "What did you have in mind?" 6 months later, the Korvani Empire established its first permanent embassy on Earth, located in what humans called Colorado, because as Dr. Reyes had explained, if you're going to learn to live on Earth, you might as well start somewhere with interesting weather. The embassy was built to withstand Category 5 hurricanes, F5 tornadoes, and Magnitude 9 earthquakes, not because Colorado typically experienced such events, but because the Korvani had learned that on Earth, typically was a word that existed primarily to be proved wrong by meteorological events. Squad leader Thaxmore had requested permanent assignment to the embassy, claiming that he needed to continue his cultural research. This research apparently involved learning to fly fish with Jim Henderson, and understanding why humans considered standing in freezing water while attempting to catch creatures that didn't want to be caught to be relaxing. Commander Vexthul had also remained, ostensibly to oversee the embassy operations, though his subordinates suspected he was really staying because Dr. Reyes had introduced him to something called extreme sports, and he'd developed what could only be described as an addiction to activities that would have been considered forms of creative suicide on any civilized world. "You want me to do what?" he'd asked when she first suggested rock climbing. "Climb that cliff face using only your natural abilities and some basic safety equipment," she'd explained patiently. "It's quite popular here." The cliff face that's several hundred meters of nearly vertical stone? That's the one. And this is recreational? For humans, yes. For someone with your natural strength and claws, it should be practically trivial. That had been 3 months ago. Now Vexthul spent his off-duty hours scaling cliff faces, whitewater rafting through rapids that could crush starship hulls, and engaging in something called base jumping that involved hurling himself off high places with nothing but a fabric canopy to prevent what any reasonable being would consider inevitable death. It was, he had to admit, the most alive he'd felt in 2 centuries. The cultural exchange was proving beneficial in ways no one had anticipated. Korvani engineering, designed for worlds where environmental stability was paramount, was revolutionizing human construction in disaster-prone areas. Human adaptive psychology, developed through millennia of living on a world that refused to behave predictably, was helping Korvani explore previously impossible worlds. But perhaps the most significant development was taking place in what humans called universities, where Korvani military strategists were learning from human historians about something called asymmetric warfare. "Let me understand this correctly," Major Kexthal said, studying a primitive projection display in what the humans called a lecture hall. "Your species defeated the Mongol Empire using weather?" Professor Martinez, an elderly human with the kind of patient demeanor that suggested years of explaining obvious things to young people, nodded. "Well, partially. The Mongols were excellent warriors, superb strategists, and nearly unstoppable on their home terrain. But they had no experience with Japanese typhoons. Typhoons? Hurricanes in the Western Pacific. The Mongol invasion fleets were destroyed by storms before they could establish a beachhead. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind." Major Kexthal made notes on his datapad. The concept of using environmental hazards as defensive weapons was revolutionary to a species from a world where the environment was predictable enough to plan around. And this was common? Throughout human history, actually. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was defeated largely by winter weather. The Spanish Armada was scattered by storms in the English Channel. Even in more recent conflicts, weather and terrain have been decisive factors. Your species weaponizes your own planet. "Our species adapts," Professor Martinez corrected gently. "We learned a long time ago that you can either work with Earth's natural tendencies or get flattened by them. Most of us prefer working with them." Major Kexthul looked out the window at the distant mountains, where he could see humans engaging in something called skiing, apparently hurling themselves down near vertical slopes covered in frozen water for entertainment, and began to understand why the galactic community had classified humanity as unpredictable rather than simply dangerous. Dangerous species were common. Species that could turn their planet's own hostility into a tactical advantage were not. The real breakthrough came during what Dr. Reyes diplomatically referred to as the volcano incident. It started when Mount Vesuvius, a volcanic formation that the humans had, with typical Earth logic, built several major cities around, began showing signs of increased activity. To the Korvani, this represented a clear and present danger requiring immediate evacuation of all personnel to a safe distance, defined as, preferably on another continent. To the humans, it represented what they called a situation that bears watching. "You're not evacuating?" Commander Vexthul asked Dr. Reyes as they stood in the newly established monitoring station, approximately 20 kilometers from an active volcano that was currently venting superheated gases and occasionally hurling molten rock into the atmosphere. "Not yet," she replied, checking readings on instruments that were apparently designed to measure the exact degree to which they were all about to die. "The activity is still within normal parameters." Normal parameters? For Vesuvius, yes. She's always been a bit temperamental. Vexthul stared at the mountain, which was currently demonstrating its temperamental nature by painting the sky red with volcanic ash, and providing what the humans cheerfully referred to as quite a light show. Dr. Reyes, he said carefully, that mountain destroyed two major cities in your ancient history. Pompeii and Herculaneum, yes. That was about 2,000 years ago. She made another notation on her datapad. We've learned a lot about volcanic monitoring since then. And this knowledge makes you comfortable remaining within its blast radius? Commander, this volcano is one of the most closely monitored geological features on Earth. We have seismographs, gas analyzers, thermal imaging, satellite surveillance, and ground penetration radar, all feeding data to prediction models that can forecast eruptions with reasonable accuracy. Reasonable accuracy? Well, nothing's perfect. But we usually get at least a few days' warning before a major eruption. Vexthul considered this. On Korvan Prime, reasonable accuracy in geological prediction meant centuries of advance warning and redundant safety systems. Here, it apparently meant probably enough time to get to higher ground. That's when the mountain decided to prove humanity's adaptability in the most direct way possible. The eruption, when it came, was not particularly large by Vesuvius standards, what the humans classified as a moderate explosive event. By Korvani standards, it was a localized apocalypse involving superheated gas clouds moving at several hundred kilometers per hour and ash columns extending into the upper atmosphere. Dr. Reyes' response was to calmly activate the emergency broadcast system and begin coordinating what she called standard evacuation procedures. Vexthul's response was to immediately contact his ship and request emergency extraction. Sir, his communications officer reported, the humans have declined our offer to evacuate them to orbit. They what? Doctor. Reyes says they appreciate the concern, but they have the situation well in hand. Through the monitoring station's reinforced windows, Vexthul could see pyroclastic flows racing down the mountain's slopes like liquid fire, while overhead, the ash plume was turning day into night. In the distance, he could make out the lights of evacuation vehicles moving in orderly columns away from the danger zone. How are they so calm about this? He asked Dr. Reyes, who was coordinating with emergency services while occasionally glancing at the approaching wall of superheated death as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient weather front. Practice, she said simply. Italians have been living with Vesuvius for millennia. When you share your neighborhood with an active volcano, you learn to be prepared. But the pyroclastic flows will follow predictable paths based on topography. We've mapped them extensively. She pointed to a display showing the mountain and surrounding area. See those evacuation routes. They're designed to keep people out of the flow channels. And if your predictions are wrong, then we adapt and learn from the experience. Vexthul watched the evacuation proceed with military precision. Civilians moving to predetermined safe zones while emergency services coordinated rescue operations for anyone caught in dangerous areas. It was, he realized, exactly like watching a military operation. Except the enemy was the planet itself, and the humans were treating it like just another tactical challenge. Your entire species, he said with dawning comprehension, has been fighting a war against your own planet for your entire evolutionary history. Fighting's the wrong word, Dr. Reyes corrected, watching the pyroclastic flows slow and cool as they reached flatter terrain. We've been learning to dance with it. The aftermath of the eruption provided Vexthul with an insight that would eventually reshape Korvani military doctrine. While his people would have considered the event a natural disaster requiring years of recovery, the humans treated it as a minor inconvenience requiring a few weeks of cleanup. Ash makes excellent fertilizer, Jim Henderson explained when Vexthul contacted him to check on the Kansas embassy staff. We get volcanic ash from time to time when the western volcanoes act up. Farmers actually consider it a bonus. You use the products of geological instability to improve agricultural yield? Well, sure. Volcanic soil is some of the richest on the planet. Why do you think people keep building cities near volcanoes? This led to a revelation that would have been obvious to any xenobiologist who actually understood what they were looking at. Humans didn't just survive on their Deathworld. They had turned its lethality into an advantage. Volcanic soil for agriculture, geothermal energy from tectonic activity, hydroelectric power from their extreme weather patterns. Even their recreational activities served a purpose. They were constantly training themselves to handle environmental extremes that would kill most galactic species. Your people, Vexthul said to Dr. Reyes during their post-eruption debriefing, are not just survivors. You're environmental warfare specialists. I suppose that's one way to look at it, she agreed, though we prefer to think of ourselves as adaptable. Your adaptability would make you formidable allies. Or formidable enemies, she pointed out mildly, which is why we're much more interested in the alliance option. Vexthul looked out at the Mediterranean, where human ships were already beginning cleanup operations in areas that were still technically within the volcano's danger zone, and made a decision that would echo through Korvani history. Dr. Reyes, I would like to propose a formal military alliance between the Korvani Empire and Earth. On what terms? We provide you with advanced technology and starflight capability. You provide us with training in environmental adaptation and unconventional tactical thinking. She smiled. I think that can be arranged. Though I should warn you, once humans get access to other worlds, things tend to get interesting pretty quickly. Interesting? Well, for example, I've already had several requests from geologists who want to study active volcanoes on other planets. And the extreme sports community is very excited about the possibility of low-gravity base jumping. Vexthul tried to imagine humans loose in a galaxy full of worlds that their inhabitants considered dangerous, and realized that the universe was about to become a much more interesting place. Dr. Reyes? Yes? I think the Korvani Empire is about to learn what your people mean when they say adventure. Epilogue. 1 year later. The first joint Korvani human expedition to survey the volcanic world of Pyrothea 7 was, by all accounts, a resounding success. The planet, which had been written off by the Galactic Survey as too geologically active for colonization, was now being considered for a research station after the human geologists described it as absolutely fascinating and perfect for volcanic studies. The Korvani military observers noted that the humans had adapted to the planet's extreme conditions within 48 hours and were already developing tactical doctrines based on using the unstable terrain against potential enemies. Commander Vexthul, now serving as military liaison to what the humans called the Terran Exploration Corps, stood on the observation deck of the joint research vessel Endeavour and watched a team of human volcanologists setting up monitoring equipment directly on the rim of an active caldera. You know, he said to Dr. Reyes, who was coordinating the mission from the ship's command center. When we first arrived at Earth, we thought we were meeting a typical Deathworld species. And now? Now I think we were meeting the only species in the galaxy that could look at a Deathworld and decide it wasn't quite dangerous enough. Dr. Reyes laughed. Just wait until you see what we're planning for the Ice World expedition next month. Ice World? Glacialis 3. Average surface temperature of 80 Celsius. Constant blizzards. Atmospheric composition that's technically toxic to most carbon-based life forms. And this appeals to your people because the skiing is going to be incredible. Vexthul looked out at the volcanic hellscape below, where humans were cheerfully conducting scientific research in conditions that would kill most galactic species, and realized that somewhere along the way, the Korvani Empire hadn't just gained allies. They'd gained teachers, and the galaxy would never be the same. End of story.